opposition is to offsetting as a policy instrument, and it usually comes down to four quite valid criticisms. The first is insufficient gain. You know, there's offsetting. There's many offset policies. There's not sufficient gain to offset the loss. There's this issue of equivalence. You know, you clear patch A and you set up an offset on patch B. How equivalent are the losses and gains? There's the time lag issue. You know, if you clear now and set up an offset, it might not mature or provide those ecological resources for centuries. And there's the issue of compliance. There's a poor record of compliance with land delivery in Australia and some offset schemes overseas. So I'll just spend a little bit of time on each of these. So the first argument was insufficient gain, and this will happen if offsets are established on sites with limited capacity for gathering, or they're under no threat of loss without any action. So some offset policies are based on simple set-aside, and this is the diagram is trying to depict this. So what happens is you have these two patches of bush before clearing. Some offset policies say, well, look, you can clear provided you set aside a patch of vegetation and you set it aside, you know, from clearing. But you can see, unless there's gains to be had on this other patch, that just results in a loss equivalent with the area cleared. You know, and it's interesting that some people interpret and earlier versions of offset policy in New South Wales, for instance, were based on this simple construct that you just set aside an area and you can clear, and but really there's no net gain there. There's net loss equivalent with the area cleared in that type of strategy. The second argument is one of equivalence. Now, if you look at the research on planted vegetation, if your offset is based on planting vegetation, planted vegetation is very different to native vegetation. It has value for biodiversity, there's no doubt about that, but it has different values for biodiversity. There's some recent work by David Lindemeyer and his team on the southwest slopes have found that that occurs even at the landscape scale, not just at the site scale. There's an interesting paper that's in an online journal, Ecology and Society, I think it's called, and they go through a whole range of arguments against offsets, but one of them they make is that you can't shoehorn restoration into a desired trajectory. So if you've got a site that you've lost values on, and you've got another site that you're going to improve to compensate for that loss or offset that loss, you can't just shoehorn an ecosystem into the way you want it to go. So that's an issue. It's interesting that there was a program on SBS many years ago about clearing in Western Australia, and I remember I don't know if it was called. I can't remember what it was called, but it was a great documentary about the history of land clearing in Western Australia. And at one point, a guy stood up on a hill overlooking a patch of bush that's remaining in the Western Australian wheat belt, and he said, "We can put a man on the moon, but we still can't replicate that." And it's true, in a way you cannot replicate all the elements of a natural ecosystem from scratch, and in particular. And there are many sort of blocks to, there's a thing called state and transition framework or state and transition models, and they show nicely that there are very many barriers to restoration that occur as ecosystems become degraded. You can't just flip the switch and turn them the other way. Now, to make an offset policy workable, another issue is that you need a metric. You need a fungible sort of numeric that you can trade from one site to another. And this often requires you to actually get all the features of natural ecosystems and put them into this a metric to build this metric. So the metrics often contain lots and lots of different variables. Now, you need to do that to make an offset policy workable. And unfortunately, though, with those metrics, there's always substitution allowed, you know. And for instance, there was a paper by Mick McCarthy and others that found that one of the perverse outcomes of habitat hectares metric that's used in Victoria is that someone could cut down trees to increase the level of coarse woody debris, and that increase in the score for coarse woody debris would offset the impacts of cutting down the trees in the first place. So, you know, the metric would record no change to the site. So there are some issues around the metrics themselves. So therefore, this like-for-like construct is really difficult to achieve, you know, in reality in an offset situation. You can be more like-for-like, but it's very difficult to be absolutely like-for-like. The other criticism is time lags. Many ecosystem features can only be restored after a long time frame. An example is tree hollows. They begin to form in eucalypts from about 120 to 220 years from that time. And you know, we have 300 odd species that use tree hollows in Australia. And yet in most offset policy, the clearing typically occurs before the offset has matured. Another criticism is compliance. Illegal land clearing is significant. From data from 2004 in New South Wales, it was interesting that there was about 22,000 hectares that were approved for clearing, but the total amount cleared for that year was 70,000 hectares. So now that's not all legal clearing. There's permitted clearing, there's exemptions, but so we just don't know. I mean, that's a big gap. 22,000 hectares approved of 70,000 in total in 2004. So, you know, we don't know what the amount of illegal clearing is in that equation. There was a study I saw from Canada that found a 14% compliance rate in a compensatory habitat or offset scheme. And we also have a poor enforcement record for land clearing legislation in Australia. State legislation in particular has been difficult to enforce in the courts. Now, so you've got to ask yourself, is this sufficient? Are these arguments sufficient to reject offsetting as a policy instrument full stop? And it's interesting that a few very prominent advisors to government say no. Say, you know, offset policy does have a role despite these limitations. And the first is the Wentworth Group in its recommendations to Bob Carr back in 2003 for reforms to native vegetation regulations in New South Wales. They intimated in their report that some type of offset mechanism was appropriate. And also in that PEMSEC report I talked about before, that was Steve Morton, Hugh Possingham and others, they didn't reject land clearing outright. They said broad-scale clearing should end, but they didn't reject it, land clearing outright. So, if, you know, these prominent advisors to government